Joe Goldberg never loved anyone. He loved the story he told himself. Spoilers ahead. The final season of You introduced Bronte, and for the first time in the series, Joe encountered someone who didn't just enable his delusions, but actively participated in constructing them. A novelist who saw Joe not as a project to fix or a monster of fear, but as raw material for a kind of tragic romantic narrative she'd built her entire career around. The finale promised resolution. Some kind of reckoning where Joe would either face consequences for years of murder and manipulation or find a way to slip through the cracks one more time. But the real question the season needed to answer wasn't about justice or escape. It was whether Joe could ever stop performing his own life, and whether Bronte represented the final trap or the ultimate escape hatch for a man whose entire existence depended on being the misunderstood protagonist of his own story. Here's the structural problem with Joe Goldberg as a character. His psychology isn't built on desire for connection. It's built on the desperate need to narrate his actions in a way that absolves him of being the villain. And every relationship he's ever had has been a test of whether the other person will accept his version of events or force him to confront the gap between his self-image and his actual behavior. Beck questioned him, so he killed her and framed someone else. Love mirrored him. So he recoiled because she reflected what he couldn't admit about himself. Marion saw through him. So he invented reasons why she was the one who needed saving from her own darkness. Kate existed in a world where Joe could perform the role of the reformed man, the protector, the one who'd learned from his past. Except that performance was just another layer of the same mechanism, rewriting reality so he never has to be accountable. Bronte changes the equation because she doesn't need Joe to change. She needs him to be exactly what he is. A dangerous man with a tragic backstory who can be transformed into art, into narrative, into the kind of doomed romance that sells books and validates her worldview that love and violence are two sides of the same passionate coin. When Joe meets Bronte, he's encountering someone who has spent her entire adult life romanticizing the exact pathology he's been hiding. Which means for the first time, Joe doesn't have to perform goodness or justify his actions through elaborate internal monologue. He can simply exist as a complicated, misunderstood, dangerous man he's always narrated himself to be, and Bronte will not only accept it but celebrate it. Turn it into literature, make it beautiful. This is why Bronte is the most dangerous person Joe has ever encountered, not because she's violent or manipulative in the ways love was, but because she offers him something far more seductive than love or acceptance. She offers him permission to stop hiding. Think about what Joe has always wanted beneath all the obsession and stalking and murder. He wants to be seen as a hero of his own story, the man who does terrible things for understandable reasons, the tragic figure whose darkness is actually depth. Every therapist he's manipulated, every girlfriend he's convinced, every internal justification he's constructed has been in service of that image. But they've all required Joe to maintain the performance, to keep pretending he's trying to be better. Bronte removes that requirement because in her worldview, Joe doesn't need to be better. He needs to be authentic, raw, true to his nature, which in her artistic framework means embracing the violence and obsession as essential parts of who he is rather than flaws to overcome. The dynamic between Joe and Bronte isn't a romance. It's a mutual enabling system where two people who have built their identities on narrative construction find in each other the perfect audience for their respective delusions. Joe gets to be the dark romantic hero he's always cast himself as, and Bronte gets to live inside the kind of dangerous love story she's been writing from a safe distance her entire career, except now it's real, visceral, happening to her, which validates every artistic choice she's ever made about prioritizing passion over safety, intensity over stability, the myth of the tortured soul over the reality of pathological behavior. They're not falling in love. They're collaborating on a shared fiction. And the tragedy is that both of them are too invested in the story to see how it traps them. Here's where the finale's choice becomes critical. If the ending lets Joe and Bronte continue this dynamic, it's validating the idea that Joe's self-deception can actually work if he finds a right enabler, someone who will rewrite reality alongside him rather than forcing him to confront it. If the ending separates them or punishes Joe, it has to answer whether that punishment comes from external forces like the legal system, or from the internal collapse of a narrative that can't sustain itself when tested against reality. And if the ending gives Joe some kind of redemption or escape, it has to reconcile that outcome with the fact that Joe has spent 5 seasons demonstrating that he is fundamentally incapable of the kind of self-awareness required for actual change. Only a performance of change when it serves a self-image. The problem is that Joe's character psychology demands an ending where he never stops lying to himself, because the moment he stops, he ceases to be Joe Goldberg and becomes just another murderer with a body count. And the show has spent too much time inside his head for that kind of reductive conclusion to feel earned. But the story also can't let him win. Can't let him ride off into the sunset with Bronte, constructing a beautiful narrative around his violence. Because that would suggest the show endorses the very delusions it's been deconstructing for 5 seasons. So the finale is trapped between character logic and moral necessity, between what Joe would actually do and what the audience needs to see happen. Here's a logically consistent alternate ending that respects Joe's psychology while acknowledging the trap he and Bronte have built together. Joe doesn't get caught by the police, doesn't face legal consequences, doesn't have a dramatic public reckoning. Instead, Bronte finishes her novel, the one she's been writing about Joe, about them, about the intoxicating danger of loving someone broken, and Joe reads it. And in reading it, he sees himself described not as he's always narrated himself. The misunderstood protector, the tragic figure doing terrible things for love, but as Bronte actually sees him, a fascinating character, a compelling case study, raw material for art. She hasn't written a love story. She's written an autopsy of pathology, a clinical dissection dressed up in romantic language. And Joe realizes that even in finding someone who accepts his darkness, he's still being observed, analyzed, turned into narrative rather than truly seen. This breaks something in Joe because his entire defense mechanism depends on controlling the story, on being the narrator of his own life. And Bronte's novel takes that power away from him by showing him that even when he thought he'd found someone who understood, she was just using him the same way he's used everyone else, as a vehicle for her own needs, her own story, her own image of herself as the kind of woman brave enough to love a monster. The horror isn't that she betrays him or leaves him or calls the police. It's that she publishes a book and becomes successful, and Joe has to watch as strangers discuss his psychology, debate his motivations, analyze his patterns, all while thinking they're engaging with fiction, never knowing it's real. He's finally been seen, truly seen, and it's not validating or redemptive. It's annihilating, because being seen means losing control of the narrative. So Joe disappears again, new city, new name. But this time there's no new obsession waiting because he's learned the wrong lesson from Bronte. Not that he needs to change, but that he needs to be more careful about who he lets into the story. He's still narrating his own life in his head, still justifying every past decision, still convinced that somewhere out there is someone who will see him the way he sees himself. But now he's also aware that every person he encounters is potentially writing their own version of him, constructing their own narrative where he's just a character. And that awareness doesn't make him better or safer. It makes him more isolated, more paranoid, more convinced that the only way to maintain his self-image is to stop letting anyone get close enough to write their own interpretation. This is the ending Joe's psychology demands. Not punishment or redemption, but the eternal continuation of the pattern with the added weight of knowing that even his moments of supposed connection were just competing narratives. And he'll never escape the gap between who he tells himself he is and who he actually appears to be to anyone outside his own head. Bronte was supposed to be the one who finally understood, and instead she proved that understanding was just another form of exploitation, which means Joe can never stop running, never stop performing, never stop narrating, because the alternative is admitting that he's exactly what he looks like from the outside, a man who destroys everything he touches and calls it love. The finale had to choose between closing the story and staying true to the character, between giving the audience the satisfaction of justice and giving Joe the ending his psychology had been building toward for 5 seasons. If Joe ever admitted what he was, he'd stop being Joe, and the show needed him to remain himself until the very end. So whether the actual finale punished him, redeemed him, or let him escape, the question is whether it respected the central truth of his character, that he is trapped in a loop of self-deception that no amount of external consequence or enablement can break, Because the loop isn't about what happens to him. It's about what he tells himself about what happens to him. And that internal narration will never stop, never admit fault, never allow him to be anything other than the protagonist of his own tragic story, even when everyone else has already written him as the villain. If you change the ending, you change the character. And Joe Goldberg is a character designed never to change, only to find new stages on which to perform the same pattern with different aesthetics. And Bronte was just the final proof that even when he found someone who claimed to accept his darkness, all he'd really found was another person writing their own story and casting a role he couldn't control.